At 7:45 on a Tuesday morning, my stepdaughter called to tell me my husband had died during the night. Then she told me he'd left everything to her. My husband was sitting 4 feet away calmly cutting a piece of toast. I remember looking at him and thinking, well, this is going to be an interesting breakfast. Dad died last night, Paige said, and her voice was so flat, it made the whole thing worse. Douglas stopped moving. Not dramatically. He just held the knife over his plate and looked at me. I put one finger to my lips. Paige kept going. He left everything to me. The house, the money, everything. You get nothing. Before I could answer, I heard Kyle in the background, her husband. He gave this little laugh and said, "Finally, you're out." That was the moment something inside me went very still. I pressed the speaker button and set my phone on the kitchen table. Paige started talking about coming over later that afternoon to secure Dad's property. She said I should probably begin packing because there was no reason to make things harder than they needed to be. Across from me, Douglas slowly put down his fork. Paige, silence. A long one. Then Douglas leaned toward the phone. "Before you clean out my house, sweetheart, could I finish my breakfast?" I heard Kyle mutter something that sounded like, "What the hell?" Then the call ended. Douglas stared at my phone. For maybe 6 seconds, neither one of us said anything. The coffee maker clicked behind me. Somewhere outside, one of our neighbors started a lawnmower, which felt absurdly normal. Finally, Douglas said, "She sounded disappointed." That hurt him more than the money. I could see it. Douglas was 68 then, and retirement had not been especially kind to him. He'd sold his commercial plumbing business 4 years earlier after nearly 3 decades of climbing ladders, crawling under sinks, and coming home with bruises he didn't remember getting. Once he stopped working, the weight came on fast. Almost 35 pounds. His right knee had been replaced and still complained every time the weather changed. His heart had started acting up. One of his medications made him dizzy if he stood too quickly. There were mornings when the man who once hauled water heaters up basement stairs needed me to help pull on his compression socks. He joked about it mostly. 3 nights before Paige's call, Douglas had chest pain while we were watching the local news. I drove him to St. Luke's North Medical Center in Middleton, where they kept him overnight because his heartbeat was irregular. He came home Monday afternoon, tired, annoyed, and convinced the hospital oatmeal had been designed as punishment. That should have been the end of it. But later we learned our neighbor Pete had left Paige a voicemail after seeing the ambulance. "Your dad had another scare," he'd said. "Renee took him back in, didn't sound good." Paige called the hospital that night. She wasn't listed as Douglas's medical representative, so nobody gave her much information. By the next morning, Douglas had already been discharged. Apparently, she called his old room and was told he wasn't there anymore. What she did not do was call me and ask, "Is Dad okay?" She went straight to "Dad is dead," and then straight to the inheritance. That part bothered me. Douglas pushed his plate away. "How does she know what my will says?" I already had an answer I didn't want to give him. 3 weeks earlier, I'd walked into Douglas's home office and found Paige crouched beside the lower filing drawer. She stood up too fast. "Oh, hey, what are you looking for? Dad's old insurance paperwork?" She smiled like it was nothing. I let it go. For 16 years, I had worked very hard not to become the suspicious second wife. Douglas's first wife, Diane, had died of ovarian cancer years before he met me. Paige had been an adult when we married, and I never tried to replace her mother. For a long time, Paige and I got along fine. Then Douglas retired. His health changed, and Paige's questions changed with it. How much did Dad get when he sold the company? Did he ever sell that warehouse? Whose name is the house in now? Douglas always had an explanation. "She's just curious. She worries about me. She's my daughter." So, I stopped pushing. That morning, I wished I hadn't. At 8:20, Douglas's cell phone rang. His attorney, Gerald Whitmore. Douglas answered. "Morning, Gerald." There was a pause. Then Douglas's face changed. "No, I'm sitting in my kitchen." Another pause. I watched him straighten in his chair. Gerald had received a call that morning from someone claiming Douglas had died. Worse, that person had mentioned the date of a will Douglas signed 14 years earlier, before he married me. Under that old will, Paige really had inherited almost everything. When Douglas hung up, he looked toward the hallway where his office was, then at me. "She wasn't grieving me." I didn't answer. He swallowed. "She was waiting for me." Gerald wanted us in his office immediately. Douglas stood up slowly, favoring his bad knee. His breakfast sat untouched behind him. And for the first time that morning, I realized Paige's phone call might not have been the problem. It might have been the mistake that exposed the real one. Gerald Whitmore's office was near Westtown Crossing, about 25 minutes from our house if traffic behaved. I drove. That mattered more to Douglas than he wanted to admit. For most of our marriage, he had driven everywhere. Road trips, dinner, doctor appointments, even the 3 blocks to the pharmacy when I could have walked. He liked being behind the wheel, but after his knee surgery and the dizzy spells from his medication, I had gradually become the driver. That morning, he sat in the passenger seat of his own pickup truck, staring through the windshield. "You okay?" I asked. "I'm apparently dead, Renee. I've had better Tuesdays." I smiled, but he didn't. Gerald was waiting when we arrived. He was 64, silver-haired, careful with his words, and had handled Douglas's business and estate documents for years. He closed his office door and put a thick folder on the conference table. "First," he said, "you're obviously alive." Douglas looked down at himself. "Good start." Gerald almost smiled. Then he opened the folder. The old will was exactly where it should have been. Douglas had signed it 14 years earlier, before we married. Paige was the primary beneficiary. There was a charitable gift to the Lakeside Children's Foundation, but most of the estate would have gone directly to her. Douglas stared at the pages. "She saw this." "I can't prove that," Gerald said, but whoever called this morning knew its date. What Paige apparently did not know was that the document had been replaced 7 years earlier. Douglas's current estate plan was nothing like the old one. I had protection if he died first. I could remain in our home. My retirement money stayed mine. Paige still inherited a substantial amount, and Douglas had created education trusts for his grandchildren. Nobody had cut Paige out. She simply wasn't getting everything. Douglas leaned back. "She thought Renee would lose the house." Gerald folded his hands. "If she believed the old will was still controlling, yes." Douglas looked at me. "She thought you'd be packing boxes before my obituary was printed." There wasn't much I could say to that. Then Gerald gave us the part we hadn't expected. Paige and Kyle had visited his office 7 months earlier. "Together?" I asked. "Together." They hadn't asked directly about Douglas's estate. Gerald would never have discussed it with them anyway. Instead, they asked what happened when an aging parent became incapable of handling money. Guardianship, powers of attorney, who could take over accounts, whether an adult child could step in if a spouse was making bad decisions. My stomach tightened. I remembered Thanksgiving. Kyle had been standing in our kitchen with a beer while Douglas struggled to sign into an account on his phone. Kyle laughed and said, "One of these days we're going to have to take those passwords away from you, Douglas." Everybody laughed, including me. Sitting in Gerald's office, it didn't sound funny anymore. On the drive home, Douglas kept defending Paige. Maybe she had panicked. Maybe Kyle had put ideas in her head. Maybe she genuinely believed the worst after hearing about the hospital. Finally, I pulled into the Maple Street Cafe because neither of us had eaten much. We sat near the window with soup and coffee. "Douglas," I said, "believing you died doesn't explain why she already knew what she planned to do with the house." He stirred his soup without eating it. I immediately regretted saying it so sharply. This was his daughter. I could be furious with her and still understand that he remembered a completely different Paige. The little girl whose bicycle he ran behind, the teenager whose softball games he never missed, the young woman he sat beside when her mother died. After a while, he said, "Maybe I should call her." "For what? Tell her I've made a miraculous recovery?" I laughed before I could stop myself. He finally smiled. That was Douglas. Even on a terrible day, he could usually find one dry little corner of it that was funny. The smile didn't last long. Paige and Kyle arrived at our house around 4 o'clock. Paige came through the door crying. She hugged Douglas. "Oh my God, Dad, I'm so sorry. The hospital wouldn't tell me anything. I thought you were gone." Douglas stood stiffly in her arms. "You could have called Renee." Paige stepped back. "I wasn't thinking." Kyle jumped in. "We were scared." I almost asked which part frightened him enough to laugh about throwing me out, but I kept my mouth shut. Then the conversation shifted, slowly at first. Kyle mentioned Douglas's driving. Paige brought up the duplicate electric bill Douglas had paid several months earlier. Then his medication. Then the time he forgot an appointment. Finally, Paige said, "Dad, we're worried about you." Douglas's expression hardened. About me or my money? Don't do that, I'm asking. Paige looked at me. That's exactly what I mean. Ever since Renee started handling everything, I handled things because your father had knee surgery. You control who talks to him. I actually laughed. I'm standing right here, Paige. So is he. She ignored me. We spoke to an attorney. Douglas went quiet. About what? Paige took a breath. Guardianship. The word changed the room. Douglas stared at her. You want a judge to decide whether I can manage my own life? It's not like that. That sounds exactly like that. Paige reached toward him. Dad, I already lost Mom. I'm not going to stand around while somebody else controls everything you built. There it was. 16 years of resentment compressed into one sentence. This wasn't only about money. Some part of Paige still saw me as the woman who had stepped into a space that belonged to her mother. Maybe fear of losing Douglas had turned into fear of losing what he owned. I couldn't tell anymore. They left 20 minutes later. The next morning, someone knocked on our front door. A process server stood on the porch. Douglas read the first page twice before sitting down at the kitchen table. Paige had filed. He rubbed both hands over his face. She really wants a court to say, I can't take care of myself. I sat beside him. Yesterday, Paige had tried to inherit from a dead man. Now she was trying to take control of a living one. And this time she had paperwork. Carol Jennings didn't waste time trying to make us feel better. That was one of the reasons I liked her. She was an elder law attorney in Madison, probably in her mid-50s, with reading glasses hanging from a thin chain around her neck and the kind of calm voice that made you listen. She read Paige's petition while Douglas and I sat across from her. Then she closed the folder. Don't dismiss this because it sounds insulting, she said. We take it seriously, answer it carefully, and document everything. Douglas shifted in his chair. I'm not incompetent. I didn't say you were. My daughter did. Carol nodded. And now we show the court why she's wrong. The problem was Paige hadn't filled her petition with obvious lies. That would have been easier. She used facts. Douglas had recently been hospitalized for an irregular heartbeat. He'd had knee surgery. His medications had changed several times. He'd forgotten a cardiology appointment the previous winter. There was also the little accident at the pharmacy. Douglas had backed his truck into a shopping cart corral. Nobody was hurt. The truck got a scratch. At the time, we laughed about it. Paige called it evidence of declining judgment. Then there was the duplicate electric bill. Douglas had paid it online, forgotten, and paid it again 3 days later. At 42, that would have been called a mistake. At 68, apparently, it belonged in a court filing. Over the next couple of weeks, Carol had us gather medical records, account statements, and anything else that documented how Douglas actually lived. The worst part for him was the cognitive evaluation. I sat nearby while a specialist asked him questions that would have seemed almost insulting under any other circumstances. What day is it? Where are we? Remember these words. Do this subtraction. Explain how you pay your household bills. Douglas answered carefully. He did well. When we walked back to the parking lot, I expected him to be relieved. Instead, he stood beside the truck with his hand on the door and stared at the pavement. What? I asked. He shook his head. When I was 47, forgetting somebody's name meant I was tired. I waited. At 68, somebody writes it down on a clipboard. That was when I understood what Paige had really taken from him. It wasn't money. Not yet. She had made him self-conscious about being old. Every stiff step, every forgotten password, every time he asked me to drive became something he wondered if other people were noticing. And I wasn't spared either. Paige's filing suggested I had isolated Douglas and influenced him into changing his estate plan. One Thursday afternoon at the Fresh Market grocery, I saw Diane's sister near the produce section. She spotted me. Then she suddenly became very interested in another aisle. A few days later, a woman from church asked me quietly, "How's Douglas doing mentally?" I went home furious. Douglas was sitting in his recliner watching a Madison Mustangs replay. I wanted to tell him what had happened. I didn't. He already had enough weighing on him. Then Carol found the money. Ironically, she found it because Paige had claimed Douglas's finances were becoming disorganized. Carol went through several years of account activity. The first questionable transfers started around Douglas's knee surgery. Back then, he could barely get downstairs. He was taking pain medication, going to physical therapy, and depending on everybody more than he liked. He had given Paige temporary access to help with bills. I remembered it. At the time, it had seemed completely reasonable. Carol spread several pages across her desk. There's roughly $210,000 here that concerns me. Douglas blinked. What? Some of it was straightforward, transfers, payments, money that eventually landed in accounts connected to Kyle's contracting business. About $195,000 could be followed with reasonable confidence. Another $15,000 or so had moved through withdrawals and transactions that were much harder to explain. I pointed to those. So, what happens to that part? Carol looked at me. We may never be able to prove exactly where every dollar went. Knowing and proving aren't always the same thing. I hated that sentence. Douglas barely spoke. 4 years earlier, he had openly loaned Paige and Kyle $95,000 when Kyle's company was struggling. That loan wasn't a secret. Douglas had even joked that he was becoming the family bank. But this was different. I never gave them another $100,000, he said. Carol tapped one document. Then we need to talk about this. She turned it toward him. There was Douglas's signature at the bottom. I looked at him. He looked at me. Is that yours? Carol asked. Douglas picked up the paper. His face changed. Yes. No hesitation, no accusation of forgery. That's my signature. The document had been signed shortly after his knee surgery. It gave Paige limited authority to handle certain financial matters while he recovered. Douglas read it again, then a third time. What if I told her she could help Kyle? He asked. I felt my stomach tighten. Did you? He looked at me. I don't know. That answer frightened him. I could see it immediately. A forged signature would have been simple. Someone else would have been the villain, and Douglas would have been the victim. But this signature was real. That night, he barely ate dinner. Around 9 o'clock, I found him sitting on the edge of the guest room bed. He had an old photograph in his hand. Paige at maybe 10 years old, missing a front tooth, sitting on Douglas's shoulders at the Wisconsin State Fair. She used to think I could fix anything, he said. I sat beside him. After a while, he said, maybe she remembers something I don't. I wanted to tell him absolutely not. I couldn't. I wasn't there for every conversation between them. And for the first time since this started, I wondered whether we might be wrong about part of it. The next evening, Carol called. I answered in the kitchen. Renee. I finished reviewing that authorization. My hand tightened around the phone. Paige did have authority. I closed my eyes. Then Carol added, but not for what she did. Carol asked us to come in the next morning. She had the authorization laid out on her conference table with yellow tabs stuck along the edges. The signature is real, she said, and Paige did have permission to act for you during your recovery. Douglas nodded. We established that. But permission has boundaries? Carol slid the document toward him. Paige had been authorized to pay Douglas's medical bills, handle household expenses, move money between his own accounts, and take care of certain transactions for his benefit while he recovered from surgery. Carol tapped one paragraph. What I don't see is permission to finance Kyle's company. Douglas leaned closer. It isn't there. No. She pulled out another sheet. I also don't see permission to pay their personal credit card, contribute toward improvements on their house, or make cash withdrawals unrelated to your expenses. I looked at Douglas. He didn't look relieved. That surprised me. For days, he had been terrified that he'd forgotten giving Paige permission. Now we knew he hadn't. Not in any meaningful sense. But the truth was worse in another way. Paige hadn't forged his trust. She had used it. Douglas had handed his daughter a key because he couldn't get around after surgery, and she had quietly started opening doors he never intended her to touch. On the drive home, he said almost nothing. That evening, things finally boiled over between us. He was standing at the kitchen counter looking through old statements when he said, maybe I still told her she could help Kyle once or twice. Douglas, I'm saying maybe. We have the paperwork. I want somebody to tell me what actually happened. Every conversation. I am telling you what I know. I put down the dish towel. He turned toward me. What do you want me to tell you? Everybody is telling me what I know. Paige says I don't remember. Lawyers ask me what I remember. Doctors test what I remember. His voice rose. And now you're doing it. That stung. I'm the one person who isn't. He stopped. I could have told him exactly what he wanted to hear. I could have said, "You absolutely never gave her permission." But I didn't know that. And after 16 years of marriage, I wasn't going to comfort him with a lie. He went upstairs. I stayed in the kitchen and washed the same coffee mug twice before realizing what I was doing. We barely spoke for the rest of the night. 2 days later, Carol called with something else. During the exchange of records, her office had received older text messages between Paige and Kyle. One of them explained a lot. Kyle had written, "Your dad won't take this public? He'd rather eat the loss than tell everybody his own daughter took money." Paige's response was shorter. "He always forgives me." Douglas read those words at Carol's office. Then he read them again. I watched something change in his face. Not anger exactly, recognition. For years, whenever Paige got herself into trouble, Douglas helped. When she ran up credit card debt in her 20s, he helped. When she needed money after her divorce from her first husband, he helped. When Kyle's business nearly folded, Douglas loaned them $95,000. Paige and Kyle hadn't necessarily believed their tracks were perfect. They believed it didn't matter. Douglas would never embarrass his daughter publicly. He would swallow the loss, keep the family peace, protect Paige from the consequences. Douglas placed the paper back on Carol's desk. That's what they got wrong. It was the first time since the petition arrived that he sounded like himself. Still, getting his confidence back took more than one good sentence. Douglas had stopped going to his Thursday breakfast with the men he used to work with. He claimed he wasn't hungry. I knew better. He thought everyone had heard about the guardianship case. One Thursday morning, I dropped his shoes beside his recliner. "Get dressed." He looked over his reading glasses. "Why?" "We're going to the Sunnyside Diner." "I'm not hungry." "Good. Their portions are too big anyway." He stared at me. "Is this part of my rehabilitation?" "Yes, biscuits and public exposure." That got a laugh. So we went. And you know what happened? Nothing. Nobody asked Douglas what year it was. Nobody tested his memory. His old foreman complained about property taxes. Another guy argued about the Mustangs. Somebody spent 10 minutes explaining why his new hearing aids were supposedly ruining his life. Douglas sat there drinking bad coffee and being treated like an ordinary 68-year-old man. It did more for him than I expected. After that, he made a decision about his estate, not an angry one. Paige wasn't completely disinherited. The grandchildren's education trust stayed intact under an independent trustee. I remained protected in the house. Paige would never again have authority over Douglas's finances, and any eventual share she received would account for money proven to have been improperly taken. Kyle received nothing. "My grandkids didn't do this," Douglas said. That was all. Then Paige's attorney sent Carol a settlement proposal. Paige would withdraw the guardianship petition if Douglas removed me from certain financial roles, appointed Paige to manage his affairs, and agreed not to pursue the disputed transfers. Carol finished reading and looked across the table. "Well," she said, "that clears up any remaining mystery." Douglas actually laughed. The guardianship hearing was set for the Dane County Government and Judicial Center in Waunakee. The night before, Douglas laid out a new sport code. The next morning his fingers were stiff, so I helped with one cuff. He looked embarrassed. I didn't mention it. "She thinks getting old made me easy," he said. "What are you going to do about it?" Douglas reached for his cane. "Show up." And that was exactly what Paige wasn't expecting. Paige was already inside the courtroom when we arrived. She had Kyle beside her and 3 relatives sitting behind them, including Diane's sister, the same woman who'd avoided me at the grocery store. I understood why they were there. Paige had spent weeks telling people the same story. Her father was declining, his second wife controlled him, and she was only trying to protect him. Then Douglas walked in with his cane, not looking 20 years younger, not pretending his knee didn't hurt, just Douglas. Paige looked at him, then quickly looked away. Her attorney started with Douglas's health, the hospitalization, the knee replacement, the medication, the missed cardiology appointment, even the shopping cart corral at the pharmacy made another appearance. Douglas answered without trying to make himself look perfect. "Yes, I forgot the appointment. Yes, Renee drives more than I do. Yes, sometimes I walk into a room and forget why I went in there." Paige's attorney glanced toward the judge. Douglas added, "My knees are bad, My hearing isn't what it used to be. None of that means my daughter owns me. I saw Carol hide the smallest smile. Then came the document I'd been dreading. Paige's attorney produced the financial authorization. He walked Douglas through it carefully. That is your signature? Yes. And you voluntarily gave your daughter authority to handle financial matters, certain financial matters? But you trusted her. Douglas looked at Paige. I did. For a few minutes, I felt the case sliding away from us. The paper was real. Douglas had signed it. Nobody could change that. Then Carol stood. She didn't dispute a single word. Yes, she said. Mr. Foster trusted his daughter. She asked Paige whether the authorization allowed her to pay Douglas's medical expenses. Paige said, yes. Household bills? Yes. Move funds between Douglas's accounts for his benefit? Yes. Then Carol changed direction. Where does it authorize you to transfer his money into your husband's business? Paige hesitated. It gave me financial authority. That wasn't my question. Silence. Carol asked about payments toward Paige and Kyle's credit card, then money connected to improvements on their house, then the withdrawals that had nothing to do with Douglas's medical care or household expenses. Paige's attorney objected to parts of it, and the judge kept Carol focused. That actually made the whole thing feel more serious. No dramatic speeches, just numbers and documents. Carol didn't claim we could prove every dollar either. About $195,000 could be connected with reasonable confidence to transactions outside the purpose Douglas had authorized. Another $15,000 or so had moved through cash withdrawals and other activity that was too muddy to pin down cleanly. I was glad she admitted that. The truth wasn't perfect. It didn't need to be. Then Douglas described the phone call. He told the judge exactly what he'd heard Paige say that Tuesday morning. My dad died last night. He left everything to me. You get nothing. Paige shook her head. I was confused. I thought he was dead. Douglas looked at her. You thought I was dead. You weren't confused about what you wanted afterward. That was the first moment Paige started to lose her composure. She insisted Kyle had handled many of the transactions. Kyle turned toward her. You knew what we were doing? I knew what you told me. You said your dad wouldn't notice half of it. Paige's face changed. Kyle shut up. Nobody needed to explain what had just happened. Even Kyle seemed to realize it about 2 seconds too late. The judge called for order. After that, the room felt different. Near the end, Douglas was allowed to speak about his wishes and his relationship with Paige. He rested both hands on the handle of his cane. You thought I was weak because I got old, he said. Paige started crying. Douglas didn't raise his voice. I know I'm slower. Renee drives when I don't feel steady. She helps me with things I used to do myself. Sometimes I forget names. Sometimes my knee hurts so badly I don't want to leave the house. He paused. Needing help from my wife doesn't make me my daughter's property. Paige wiped her face. Douglas looked down for a second before continuing. The money hurt. These court papers hurt, but that wasn't the worst part. He looked directly at her. The worst part was hearing how happy you sounded when you thought I was dead. Nobody moved. I'd been angry with Paige for weeks. In that moment, I wasn't. I just felt terribly sad for Douglas. The guardianship petition failed. There was no movie-style arrest afterward. Nobody put Kyle in handcuffs outside the courtroom. Carol explained that the disputed money was a separate matter. The guardianship case is over, she told us. The money isn't. That was good enough. Outside the courthouse, Paige caught up with me. Douglas and Carol were several steps ahead. You turned him against me, Paige said. I looked at her. There were 100 cruel things I could have said. I didn't need any of them. Paige, your father was sitting beside me when you celebrated his death. I didn't have to turn him against anybody. She opened her mouth, then closed it. Douglas came through the doors behind us, leaning a little heavier on his cane than he had that morning. I went to him. You okay? He exhaled. Tired. Then he glanced back at the courthouse. For a dead man, I think I did pretty well. I laughed. So did he. And after weeks of doctors, lawyers, accusations, and people deciding what Douglas could or couldn't do, we walked to our truck at exactly his pace. Nobody hurried him. Winning in court didn't fix our family. I think that surprised Douglas. For months, Paige barely spoke to him. No Sunday calls, no random pictures of the grandkids. At Thanksgiving, she sent a 2-line text instead of coming over. Douglas pretended it didn't bother him. I knew better. One night, I found him sitting at the kitchen table after midnight turning his phone over in his hands. "Maybe I should have just let the money go," he said. "And the guardianship?" He didn't answer. "That wasn't about money, Douglas." "I know. You can forgive somebody without handing them the keys again." He nodded, but slowly. That was the hard part. Nobody tells you about boundaries. Sometimes doing the right thing doesn't feel good. Sometimes it just hurts differently. The financial dispute took months to settle. We never recovered every dollar. Carol's office could document roughly $195,000 well enough to pursue. But some cash withdrawals remained too murky. In the end, Paige agreed to repay a substantial portion over time, rather than keep fighting. Douglas accepted it. Kyle's contracting business didn't survive the following year. Not because Douglas destroyed it. That distinction mattered to me. Douglas simply stopped rescuing them. Kyle eventually took a salaried construction management job. Paige went back to full-time work. They sold their oversized house and moved into a smaller place. For years, whenever Paige fell, Douglas had quietly put a cushion underneath her. This time, he stepped back. Gravity did the rest. He never punished the grandchildren. Their education trusts remained exactly where they were, except Douglas appointed an independent trustee to manage them. "My grandkids didn't do this," he reminded me. A few months later, his oldest granddaughter mailed him a birthday card. Nothing expensive, just a card with crooked handwriting inside. "Happy birthday, Grandpa. I love you." Douglas read it at the kitchen counter. Then he put it on the refrigerator with a magnet from our old trip to Door County. He never mentioned the settlement that day. The card mattered more. Life got ordinary again, which was exactly what we needed. Douglas started cardiac rehab and complained about it with impressive consistency. He lost 15 pounds over several months. His knee still hurt. He still got lightheaded occasionally if he stood too fast. And yes, sometimes I still helped him with those compression socks. I wasn't exactly aging backward myself. Years of work, menopause, stress, and taking care of other people had changed my body too. There was a time when I looked at old photographs and wondered where that slimmer woman had gone. Eventually, I stopped asking. She hadn't gone anywhere. She had simply lived another 16 years. About 9 months after the hearing, Paige asked Douglas to meet her for coffee, alone. I told him to go. When he came home, I didn't ask questions right away. He hung his jacket up, poured himself water, and finally sat across from me. Well, she apologized. I waited. Good apology. He made a face. Started out terrible. I laughed. Paige blamed Kyle at first, then debt, stress, her fear after losing her mother, her resentment toward me. But eventually, she said something honest. "I started thinking of what you had as something that was already mine." Douglas told me he sat there for a while before answering. Then he said, "You started inheriting me before I was gone." That was the sentence Paige finally seemed to understand. Douglas didn't restore her access to his accounts. She didn't become his power of attorney. There were no dramatic hugs and promises that everything would be the way it used to be. It couldn't be. But they started talking again, carefully. Sometimes forgiveness is a door you open 8 inches instead of throwing it wide. That was enough. One Saturday morning, months later, Douglas and I were sitting at the same kitchen table where this whole mess had started. His pill organizer was beside the napkin holder. I was drinking coffee. Douglas was buttering toast. Then my phone rang. We both looked at it. Douglas pointed his butter knife toward me. "You answer it." "Why? Last time we got a call before breakfast, I found out I was dead." I smiled. Technically, I answered that call too. He thought about it, then nodded. "See, memory's still good." I laughed so hard I nearly spilled my coffee. And strangely enough, that ordinary morning felt more like winning than the courthouse ever had. We were older, slower, a little heavier, a little more careful going downstairs. But we were still here, still making our own decisions, still sitting at our own table. Aging can take some speed from you. It can change your body and shape your confidence. But it doesn't give anyone, not even family, the right to take your dignity along with it. If you've ever had to set a boundary with someone you still loved, then you probably know why this was harder than it looked. Sometimes protecting yourself and loving someone have to exist at the same time. Thanks for listening.